So, this week in the AI files, we will cover off a few key topics, one of them being CEO Dario Amodei from Anthropic and his quote of the week that focuses around AI code writing. Not to be outdone, we'll also talk about how Meta is utilizing their own chips for AI development.
And OpenAI came with some amazing announcements about the response API that really make the agent development much easier. And along with that, computer use agent is also now available.
And not to be outdone, we'll talk about Google and their announcements with Gemma 3 and Flash 2.0 with its native image generation.
AI is now spilling over into the physical world as well through the robotics models like Gemini Robotics. We'll talk about that and a lot more in this episode. Stay tuned. Greetings. Welcome to the AI Files podcast. If you're looking to stay up to date on the AI, this is the podcast for you. I'm Shadab Hussain. I'm the director of AI at Microsoft, and I'm your co-host.
Hello, everybody. Jamie Basilico, as you know already. I'm the other co-host here for the AI Files. My day job is a data and AI technical specialist and architect. And as a reminder, please note this is not an official Microsoft channel, so the views and opinions expressed by myself and Shadab are our own and do not represent the views of Microsoft. So let's get into the quote of the week for this week. And it comes from Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei. And what was interesting with this is his prediction around how AI will be writing code. Specifically, here's his quote: "We're 3 to 6 months from a world where AI is writing 90% of the code. And then in 12 months, we may be in a world where AI is writing essentially all of the code." Now, take that for what it may be. I mean, obviously, Dario and what Anthropic is pushing with their Claude model is, in my opinion, probably the best model for coding. So, of course, he's going to focus on things that revolve around the coding aspect. Now, what I think is mind-boggling with this quote is, at least from his perspective, from Dario's perspective, we're within 6 months of AI being able to write 90% of the code. That if you think about what that means, it can mean a whole bunch of different things. One is where we think about job security. When we look at how AI has been able to, start by writing code. I mean, it goes back to when GitHub Copilot, one of the first to write these coding assistants paired with the, IDE or the development environment. That was mind-boggling. But, we have new tools today, especially with Anthropic's Claude Sonnet 3.7 and 3.7 thinking. The amount of code that's able to be generated from these tools, especially when you couple it with like something like Cursor or some of the other IDEs that are out there, let alone Visual Studio Code with GitHub, it's really pushing the envelope. So the security concern would be, is this going to put some of the people out of their jobs in terms of coding? I don't personally believe that. I think you're always going to have the need for reviewing code at the very least. So, it goes back to where are we today? I think we've certainly come a long way with code generation from these tools. Are we going to be, within 6 months, 90% of the way there with code? I don't know. We've heard some recent quotes from some very large organizations that 30% of their code is actually generated from AI. So taking that leap to 90% seems a little far-fetched to me, especially with the second part of the quote, that within 12 months, essentially all the code would be AI written. There's a couple of other ancillary sort of notables from this. NVIDIA's CEO, Jensen Huang, actually recommended that maybe people look at alternative careers, whether or not that might be in biology, education, manufacturing, or farming, as far as more secure alternatives to pure coding. Now, to me, that's sort of just swinging the pendulum way far to the right to say, oh, don't go down a path with coding or, quote unquote, computer science or computer engineering. What I do believe is that this opens up the opportunity for evolving of the roles. So instead of just being, a person that's going to focus on um, writing code themselves. It's about how do you evolve as a coder, as an engineer, to work with these AI generation tools. Where, all right, maybe you don't have to write the mundane set of tasks that everyone had to write 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, but it's the ability of working with these tools rather than trying to avoid them. So anyway, pretty bold prediction from Dario from Anthropic. I'd love to get your take on Shadab. What do you think? Is this a reality? Is this something that's truly going to happen, or is this more or less a marketing ploy from Dario?
Yeah, Jamie, what a great quote that you have for this week. This is such an escalation, right? I mean, in terms of the timeline, that we know that these predictions about the AI writing a bulk of code or most of the code or all the code has been around, but people have been thinking like few years away. And but this is such an escalation of the timeline, right? So that's surprising. Um, and it also actually highlights that this new paradigm that is emerging, right? Because this, like every job is going to transform with AI, and particularly so on the coding part, right? So it's like already people are talking about, right, the coders are going to become like creators, right? We have to start thinking of a new paradigm of for them, right? It's not like just coding now, it's like more creation. You're going to build more apps rather than, like, and you'll bring a lot of other aspects to that, right? Like creativity, the design, the use cases, and things like that, right? So it's a whole gamut of thing. Just coding alone, if somebody is just relying on a career as just simple coder, that I think is going to be kind of extinct, right? Yes, I agree, but I also feel that I think sometimes it could, like, I just want to make sure that it is not misconstrued by certain people, that okay, there is absolutely no role left for the coders or creators, right? It is not so. It is about the productivity, right? You would still need, as you indicated, Jamie, right? You would still need people to actually feed, to use these AI assistant tool, right? I mean, they're not gonna themselves decide what to do. They have to be told what to do, right? And they will do it, but somebody has to do it. Somebody has to be aware of the software engineering methodology. Someone has to know. Now, of course, it's going to be a 10x, right? We have talked about the 10x software engineer, right, who can do things very productively. This probably make them 20x or 25x, right? um, but you would still need people, but not as much. I think that is the crux of the thing, not as much. And that brings the question that what would happen to industries like, for example, learning and skilling industry, right? um, just based on this quote, Jimmy, Andrew Ng, who has founded deep learning AI, and he has been part of the Google Brain earlier. um, and he runs a lot of learning courses, right? And of course, there's a conflict of interest for him, but he also pushed back saying that no, the learning will still be required. You would still need to learn coding. You would still need to know, because in order to generate these things, you still need to know what these are and communicate with the tools and things like that. That could be a bit biased statement as well, because it directly affects the industry, right? Because if the human are not going to code, then why would they need to learn the coding?
Right. Exactly.
So that is the thing. The other thing is also, like, think about the services industry, the consulting companies who have relied so much on there's a huge, like, billions of dollars in that industry, who have relied on providing services. What would happen to that? So I think that industry is also going to be impacted quite a bit, a lot of bit, actually, in fact. um, to the point that, that now the skill will be more like about reviewing what AI has generated. That part, I'm not sure how will that emerge, because if the AI can write it, of course there is another AI who can also review and test it, right? So,
Yep.
the testing part is not like going to be much big, to be honest, in my view. um, but yeah, I mean, I think, how much will that impact? Do people still need to do computer science and engineering? I think they still do, because you still need to develop chips, you still need to develop new techniques, you need to write new frameworks and create. AI is not going to do everything. It's only going to replicate what it has been taught to do, right? So
It's,
I
it's,
think there is still a
yep.
scope in it, but only high quality. That's right.
So it's interesting. You raise a point on the last one around you still need computer scientists, computer engineers to develop new techniques, new coding. I wonder if we do. Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Mhm.
As our models, I say our models, the world's models, as they evolve and as they get more sophisticated, and once we reach the level, I guess, of AGI or even surpass that, they're going to be able to think for themselves. I mean, we already have thinking or reasoning models, right? So is it safe to assume that we, again, collective we, the companies that are building these models, can they get to a point where they build a model that's smart enough, has enough intelligence, enough reasoning behind it, that they could create new languages, new computer programming languages? And I bring that up because I heard, and I forgot who I was mentioning this, but if we get to a point where no one is building code and the only thing that's building code is AI, how would we ever advance coding languages? I mean, if you think about what we have now as far as languages versus what we had 25 years ago, I mean, we'd still be at Visual Basic, I guess, if we didn't have people that were advancing languages like React or TypeScript, just as an example. But so I pose the question: is perhaps it's not as, I don't want to say bleak as, like, if we get to a point where it's all coding by AI, does that mean we stop inventing or we stop evolving coding? I would argue that we don't, because we'll get to a point where the models themselves could come up with new techniques, new coding languages. The same way that we look at these AI models for specific use areas, like in gene therapy or genomics, that they're coming up with new proteins. Theoretically, we should be able to use the same concepts for these models to then come up with new techniques, new programming languages, and how to use them most effectively. Anyway, it's a little bit of far-fetched
That's a very good point, Jamie. I agree that if we reach the AGI where it can create its own framework, it can create its own languages, right? I mean, it doesn't need. I totally agree, and that's a high possibility. But I also feel that all of this is dependent on the assumption that everybody adopts equally, right? And
Yeah,
this is where I feel that big if lies, because human beings as a race are hard to predict and hard to adopt honestly,
yeah,
right? Think about it, right? Like the cloud, right? It has been around, very mature, and we a lot of companies know that they should be doing it, but are they doing it? Like, there are still companies, not even like, there are probably only very very handful companies who are doing it 100%, right? There are
right.
a lot of companies who have still not taken the step, even though they know that they have to take it, right? They're going at their pace. So similarly, how soon and how quickly the companies will adopt these tools, that's a question. Yes, I mean, there are always pioneers, there are always early birds who will adopt them, yes, and they will always be there, but they are still there. They've already done that with other technologies. But is the whole industry going to adopt it? When? And also think about it, right? It's not just about US, it's about global as well. Will every country have the same movement? I'm not sure. So overall, if you look at the planet level, I think it's doubtful that timeline will be this quick. I think this is more about the pioneers timeline, in my view, that okay, in next 1 year all these pioneers will 100%
I
AI
definitely,
generated.
yeah, and I definitely agree with that, and I could base it on my own observations. We work with large customers, large organizations, but I also work with some smaller organizations in and outside of work directly. And I've seen personally that large organizations, yes, why they may be using AI for, like, an assistant in code development, they're not embracing it to totally replace a coding engineer, right? Smaller companies, though, I've seen just the opposite, because they may not have all the people or the resources to, potentially, like, pay out somebody. Let's put it bluntly. So they're turning to AI in a more rapid adoption for coding because they need to. So those are the ones that I see are, closer to the 90% or maybe even the 100% today because of their situation. So it goes back to what you said. You may have this, like, disparity between those that are actually adopting in small increments versus organizations that might be going fully into it, partly because they have to and partly because they want to. Anyway, and
Exactly.
yeah, I think we could spend probably a whole hour just on this one
That is
topic.
that is true. And one more thing I wanted to mention, Jamie, this is an extreme scenario, but I think it is also a possibility given that the human nature is that, with the widespread displacement, right, or the labor reduction or things like that, it can trigger a huge backlash as well. Like, I mean, look at this, what is happening right now, right? Look at this Tesla boycott, for example, right? People are just reacting because just they don't appreciate the approach that Musk is taking. Similarly, what may happen is that people like feel that okay, AI just taking, and then they just stop adopting, right, and they start resisting. I mean, ultimately it's all human, because ultimately, um, you know i- ultimately the humans have to adapt to this, right? The AI itself is not going to force itself to everybody. So I think that's an extreme scenario, but I think that's a possibility, because if things go very quick and very disruptive, it will be resisted. That's another problem. And also, economy is a cyclical thing, right? The people who get paid also spend, and the dollar goes back to the same company who are paying them. If the people are not in the employment, how will they spend? I mean, it's a massively complicated system, and I think that's what those forces will determine how quickly AI will actually realize this vision. That's my last word to say.
Yep.
Okay, let's move in. Jamie, this was really a hornet's nest that you triggered, really. So I will continue to have probably more discussion on it. We'll see. It's a very interesting aspect of it. But let's move to the other news. In the other news, the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, expands the Microsoft antitrust investigation into AI business practices, and a lot of that has been around the Microsoft investment in OpenAI, honestly, and the potential unfair advantages, and also related to the cloud software licensing rules, etc. Right, um, and essentially FTC and I think Lina Khan is now gone, or did she? I mean, I'm I'm not up to date on that one, but there was a lot of focus on this, particularly this relationship. But I think um, this issue has been diluted a lot now, right? Because Microsoft and OpenAI, I think, have deliberately designed a lot of things in the way that this scrutiny is not as warranted anymore. Because look at this, right? OpenAI has gone into Stargate with Oracle and SoftBank, and plus Microsoft has also done other partnerships. Microsoft has its own model, which are also competing. I think there is enough defense now to this argument that OpenAI and Microsoft is completely monopolizing the market, which is not the case. I mean, there are so many other companies, Google and Anthropic and AWS, their relationship. I don't think it is a one-sided market anymore. So, we will see how this work out. But this thread is still on, just to let viewers know.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a different world than I would say, let alone 2 months ago. Going back a year or 9 months ago, it's definitely not the same world that we're living in. And you see that, even based upon some of the things that we talked about in last episode on models that are being created and some of the, I don't want to say device thing, but some of the separation from some relationships that had been forged previously. That's a very political way of me getting out of that one.
I
All
know
right.
you're carefully choosing the word.
So let's hit on something else when we talk about like the big players. We certainly have Microsoft is one of them, Google, AWS, but Meta is obviously also a big player in AI, and they're rolling out their own set of AI chips, which is a huge cost savings potential. Now, I'll remind people that Meta did try to build a similar chip for training and inferencing, but did not have, you know, didn't have success with that originally. But they did build an inferencing chip that's being used for recommendations within Instagram and Facebook. So they took that success and built upon it. So they're actually testing their first custom AI training chip right now. And it's obvious why they're doing it. I mean, everyone pretty much relies on NVIDIA and their chips for not only training but inferencing. So the big reason for this, other than not wanting to rely on a single source as you're sourcing for hardware, but the big one is to cut expenses on that. This number to me is mind-boggling, which kind of just fuels the reason why NVIDIA, at least recently, maybe not in the last 2 or 3 days. Hopefully, you haven't looked at your portfolio recently, but the potential cost reduction that Meta will have by building this infrastructure using their own chips could end up saving them 119 billion. Yes, I said B with a billion with a B for 2025 alone. So, we're talking north of $100 billion in 1 year just by using those chips as a cost savings. So, extrapolate that out, by 5 years, you think about how much money potentially could be saved. What's interesting to me on this is that Meta is working with TSMC, which hopefully everyone knows is a Taiwan-based chip manufacturer, to produce the chip. So again, working in collaboration with another partner vendor rather than just buying chips directly from NVIDIA. So the goal of this obviously is to roll out this chip inside of Meta for training, obviously of models like Llama, but to use it inside of their recommendation engines and to integrate that into their own generative AI products, like potentially a chatbot. I know we haven't talked about this. It kind of made the rumor mill last week, but there was some news that Meta may try to roll out their own chatbot type of tool similar to OpenAI. So
Right.
you kind of see some of the target areas, and in order to do that, you need a heck of a lot of horsepower. And if you're running all that horsepower on something other than your own hardware, then it gets very costly. So obviously, to me, this is a cost cutting, make the bottom line look better, and promote their own potential tools with capabilities that they can bring firsthand.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, to be honest, as a Meta person to invest in this, because there's just so much need for this inferencing. Because remember, all this Meta AI goes into all their products, so their consumption is rising.
Yep.
Um,
So other than that, we mentioned Meta. I know that there's been some pretty big announcements this past week from OpenAI. Do you want to enlighten us on what OpenAI just kind of brought to the masses? And in my opinion, this is pretty big news for a couple different reasons.
yeah, absolutely. I think you know. Uh, a couple of big announcements, I would say, or rather, one major announcement. It has multiple smaller ones wrapped up in it. Um, OpenAI actually launched something called Responses API, and it's in the public preview. And Responses API is is a new API primitive that they have launched, because OpenAI has had multiple APIs, right? They have completions API, for example, chat completions API, which has been like mostly text in, text out kind of things, and then they have added the audio also in it, etc. And then they have the real time API, which is separate, and then they have the assistant API. And if you want to build the application, right, or if you want to build an agent, what would happen is that you will have to potentially use multiple APIs, right? And then you will have to maintain the context, you will have to maintain the coherence between the different APIs, etc. Right? So it becomes quite a bit of task for the users. Now, what they have done is they have created this consolidated responses API, which will have everything within it, right? So, for example, if you want to use, let's say, the features like file search is a feature where you use that to actually search on on certain data, right? Which could be in the files, etc., or a data store. So that is a file search feature, or it could be a web search, for example. So you could use that agent. In fact, the web search is the same agent. The same capability that the chat GPT currently uses to provide the latest search results. Similarly, they have the computer use agent. So all these agents are now getting combined within this response API. You can make use of those capabilities and make the calls. You can also have, for example, you can do the function calling. You can also actually maintain the context, right? So with a unique response ID, you can actually maintain the context within the response API. So just imagine like this, that using this same response API, you can actually build the entire application or the agent, within the response AI framework. um, and also actually they had they have also launched computer use agent along with it, right? So computer use agent is also now in the public preview, which is also what you can actually call from the response API. And computer use agent, just as a quick reminder, is essentially, it's a core model that they talked about earlier when they talked about their agent called operator, which actually uses this facility called computer use agent model. Essentially, it allows you to actually interact with the UI, right? So, for example, it's something similar to what Anthropic had also launched, and they call it computer use as well. It is where, like, for example, you want to book a ticket, or you don't have to use the services. You can actually directly browse the websites, or you can, add the item to the shopping cart, things like that, just like a human do, right? I mean, you don't have to like have a separate more like services API or endpoints to actually converse. You can actually directly browse in a browser and then go for it. And their implementation is slightly different, right? It's in the virtual machine. Jamie, you talked about it earlier when they announced this. So it's a pretty good implementation that they've done for the computer use, because as you can see on the screen, you provide the task as a text command, and it takes also the snapshot screenshot of the UI, and then according to that, it then creates the action, and those actions get executed on it in a virtual machine. So it's like isolated, so it's not completely taking over your console or the computer. It is actually spawning a separate virtual machine to execute it. It also provides some safety and security also along with that. So that's what is also now available to actually use within the response API as well. um, but going back just quickly to the response API, it just again, response API is based on API, so it's a pay as you go, in the sense that you are going to pay the model that you're going to consume. The API itself doesn't cost anything, and it's available now by the OpenAI, and it's also going to be available within the Azure OpenAI very soon. It's already announced. They're just doing the final test, and it will be available now. Now that begs the question: the response API. Now, what's the difference between the response API and Azure AI agent service that we have talked about before? So, just a clarity: response API is specifically from OpenAI alone, right? So it only is for the OpenAI. But Azure AI agent service, which is part of the Azure AI Foundry, is is an agent development service which goes beyond the OpenAI models, right? So, for example, you have Llama models, you have Cohere models, you have the some of the Microsoft models that you can also actually use within the agent service, and it has Microsoft's own functions, etc., that you can also call to connect with, let's say, Bing or the Fabric or things like that. So, that ecosystem is much wider and go way beyond the OpenAI. Response API is, in my view, I think it's a consolidation of the essentially chat completion and assistant API and real-time API, etc., all in one service. In fact, they have said that chat completions API will remain as a standalone service also, but it's the response API is the superset of the chat completion. However, the assistant API, by I think the end of 2026 sometime, it will go away and everything will get merged into the response API. Okay, so yeah,
Yeah, and I was going to say the same thing. I mean, it's all about simplicity and having to only deal with one instruction set or one API. Because as you just said, right now, if you were going to do anything with assistance, you have to do that coding with the assistance API. If you were going to do just the chat completions, well, that's going to be the chat completions API. And then you need to kind of interweave those two together if you're going to build, quote unquote, any type of meaningful Gen AI applications. So what OpenAI is doing is saying, all right, doesn't make sense to have two different APIs. Let's combine it into one, make it simpler. So if you think of it this way, the Responses API is really a superset of what is within today's chat completion or today's assistance API, if you looked at it on its own. And the point that you made about the Microsoft Azure AI agent SDK, it's a key point, because if you're using the OpenAI Responses API or the Agents SDK, you're limited to just the OpenAI AI models, whatever they are, soup du jour as of today, right? But with the Microsoft Azure AI Agent SDK, you're opened up to any of the models within the model catalog that is supported by that agent, let alone the things you touched upon around the tools, quote unquote, the connectors, like connecting into SharePoint or Microsoft Fabric, or other capabilities that allow the agent SDK to automatically connect into things like Logic Apps or Power Automate pieces. You're not going to get that out of the box connector capability from the OpenAI, Responses API or Agents SDK. So that's a major differentiation as people start to look at what these platforms, what these tools, what these APIs are going to provide to you. And it's about simplicity.
Yeah. And I think one more thing, Jamie, that I think there was a survey done. On average, any enterprise is using at least 3 different models. So that's an important point, right? Most of the enterprises are not just using one provider's families of models, multiple. And that's where the agent service, Azure AI agent service, becomes more handy, because it can cut across different family of models. And by the way, one more thing, they also actually announced that the Swarm, which was actually a framework to develop agents, is also going to be available now as the Agents SDK. They've kind of like finalized it, formalized it. Earlier, it was just a research project.
So that's the OpenAI responses and SDK, or Agent SDK. Let's talk about some other launches that came out just this past week, and that's one from Google. So Gemma has been around for at least a little while, but they introduced Gemma 3, which is really a collection of lightweight, state-of-the-art open models designed to run on a single GPU or TPU. So this is based upon the same research and technology from the Gemini 2.0 models. So the performance here, and this is really the thing that's a kicker, outperforms other models that are much larger, such as like the Meta Llama 405B model and the DeepSeek V3 models themselves. So this is really providing the capabilities around advanced text and advanced visual reasoning that are still within those other models, but doing it at a such smaller footprint, which then leads to efficiency. So these models, as I mentioned before, come in much smaller versions. They come in a 1 billion, 4 billion, 12 billion, and a 27 billion parameter model. And what these things do is they reduce the amount of computational requirements that are needed to run, quote unquote, your inferences. Let me bring up something real quick, and this will illustrate the point pretty well. So this is the Chatbot Arena ELO score, and you could see this is the larger of them, the largest of the Gemma 3 models. This is the 27 billion parameter model. So you can see the ELO score is in between DeepSeek V3 and R1. So this beats out the O3 mini model. It obviously beats out the DeepSeek model. What's interesting, and again, this comes straight from Google, but the intersection here of the compute resources, this is what really, to me, is noteworthy here. So they've got an ELO score that is very high as compared to, again, like DeepSeek V3 and R1, but the compute requirements on that it just dwarfs the amount of requirements or hardware requirements that are needed from those other models. And here's an example here. If you look at the DeepSeek R1 or even the V3, there is over 32 nodes or over 32 compute resources needed to run that. But with the Gemma 3 model in the 27 billion parameter, this is running on one GPU. So let that sink in there for a second. One GPU versus 32 of them, and it's got a score, at least against R3 or V3, that beats it, and R1, it's pretty darn close. So this is just stressing the output that you get from this Gemma 3 model. And again, this is a small model. You could use it. Obviously, the intent here is to run it on devices, things that could run on a single GPU. So that is one of the big notables from this. So,
what does this chatbot arena ELO score measure, just for our viewers' context?
Yeah, so the ELO score actually measures the user's preference for the output for the models, and you can actually see it here if I kind of scroll down a little bit. So it's basically, do I prefer the output responses from one model to the next? So this is not some theoretical model that comes up with something like the MMLU score, right? This is more or less like how you and I perceive the output from a model. And I know a lot of people look at this ELO score, in some cases, even more telling than something like an MMLU score, because this is real life. How do I interpret that?
So this is more like a public choice award.
Yes. Yeah, that's that's a good way of putting it. I like that one. I got to remember that.
Okay, awesome.
So there's a couple of other things also around, Gemma itself. They put a couple things in terms of safety and development. So they, various different rigorous protocols in terms of safety, including extensive data governance and alignment with various different safety policies. They looked at specific evaluations. Also, they put out Shield Gemma, which this was co-launched, and it's a powerful way of actually doing a safety checker. So it looks at safety labels, dangerous content, sexual, explicit material, and violence. Very similar, eerily similar to Microsoft Content Safety. But again, wanted to point that out because these are things that can go along with the Gemma model. And in this case, again, is Shield Gemma version 2. One last thing too, in terms of where you can actually get this. So this is on, you can get it obviously through Google directly, but it's also on Hugging Face and their transformers. So you could build directly against this. You could use various different tools, things like PyTorch to integrate with the Gemma model. So anyway, with that, I'll leave it at that one. Actually, one last thing, as I mentioned, you could also get this through Google AI Studio Hugging Face, but also through Kaggle. I'll jump into one other thing because Google put out a lot of things this past week, and that is the Gemini 2.0 Flash. So what is this Flash new model? So the model that they put out, the Flash model has been out there. What's different about this last one? By the way, I think this one got overshadowed a little bit based upon the Gemma model coming out, but this has native image generation coupled with your textual inputs. All right, so now you might be thinking, all right, well, that doesn't sound too earth-shattering because there's tools that will generate images, whether or not you're dealing with something like Midjourney or you're dealing with other image generation tools like DALL-E, right? But that's not what this is. The image generation provides not only an image, but it provides the text along with the image to describe the things that are coming. So if I say, create a image of a horse. And why am I picking a horse? Because that's what Gemini Flash on the Google site showed. But it will generate that image, but then textual concepts around that. So basically providing a story with your image at the same time that you interact with it. So it's basically conversational descriptions of those images. Now, the other thing about conversational description of imaging is I could actually use NLP or natural language prompting to edit the image. So this is actually iterative image editing directly through the use of the Gemini 2.0 Flash model. And it uses its understanding of the world to enhance the reasoning to provide detailed imagery around it. So you're getting very, very in-depth modeling of imagery coupled with your textual context. And the other thing too is that the text rendering around the image as well provides very good text accuracy within that image, which is very important because if you're doing things like advertising or social media posts, you know how difficult it is to actually get images with built-in text within the image itself. There's a couple of models out there that are better than others, but the ability to do that in a single model that allows you to build narratives around that image at the same time, but also allows image editing after the fact, that's sort of a groundbreaking. This is why I said this model release kind of got overshadowed by some of the other things that Google put out, as well as some of the other things that we just talked about with OpenAI. So this to me is somewhat of a groundbreaking. I would say try it for yourself. It's pretty interesting technology.
Yeah.
I'll show you something just real quick. Let me just share my screen again.
Yeah, usually what happens is that if you generate the images, the text, rendering within the image is many times inaccurate, or it's like it's like or jumbled up. You can't really make out what it is trying to say. But this looks like good, and it's also just a reminder. A lot of people think that the new models are multimodal. Yes, they are, but on the input side they usually are they only generate the text as an output. For example, GPT-4o will only generate text. However, DALI does generate the image, right? And then in the chat GPT, if you ask, it will give you the output, and people think that okay, the models are multimodal output as well, but that's not always the case.
Right. So here's the the Google page. You can see, and this is why I mentioned some things around the horse. But here's the example where it's generating text and image together. So you ask for what you want, and it will generate that that image. But it's providing textual information as well on what is in the image. So this is why I say it's coupling two different concepts together. And then I mentioned about the image editing. So you can see here, can you add some flowers to the table? And if this thing goes on, you'll see it'll add, flowers to the table structure. So this is that interaction back and forth, like, oh, let me do this. Let me change that. This model is capable of actually doing it. And then I mentioned about the real world understanding. It understands physicality of our world. And then, how does that create the right context into the image itself? So it's not going to go off, and I'm not going to say it's totally not, but it's not going to go off and create something that's out of the realm of physicality or what physics might actually introduce. Now, if you tell it to break the rules of physics and try to build something, yeah, it'll do that. But again, it understands the world, and this is what I think is an important piece. And as I mentioned already, text rendering, so it could introduce text rendering inside the images. So again, I know that this is super hard, or previously super hard to do. I've only seen one model come fairly close and pretty good at it. But the ability of this doing it lends itself to another tool in your arsenal to create graphics with images that you can use, in your work life, posting things or whatever use cases you have around it.
Wow, Google was pretty active, isn't it? They launched a lot of things. In fact, another launch that they also made, Jamie, was Gemini Robotics. So this is actually another advanced vision language action call it VLA. There's so many acronyms out there.
Yeah.
It is built based on the Gemini 2.0, and now it includes the physical actions as the new output modality for controlling robots, right? So, as we just discussed about the modality, there's a text, there's an image, there's an audio. You could even generate videos. But here is a whole new output modality, which is the action in the real world. And these are specifically built for the robotics, but it's based on the Gemini 2.0. What they do is they actually allow the models, they allow the robots to understand the commands, the voice command that you make. They will understand. They will be able to use these models' ability to understand the context, recognize the objects, relate the action, have a sequence of plan, right? Because robots generally so far have been generally more like, okay, pre-trained, you have to train them for certain action, etc. But because they're going to use these models, what happens is that, let's say for example, if they uncover a new kind of object which they don't know about, they have not been trained on, using these models, they will be able to recognize those objects, understand the action that is required, adjust, create a plan, just like a model does, LLM model does, and then execute based on that. So it's a great new seamless integration between the physical world of the robots and the LLM and the models to give them an understanding. So it's a new powerful way of combining this. And this model is actually also, it also comes with a lightweight model called which is like it's called embodied reasoning abilities, but it's a kind of a, you can say, lightweight model. And roboticists, they can actually run their own programs using this lightweight model. um, this is actually, Google DeepMind is actually partnering with Aptronic to build these next generation of humanoid robots, which will be based on this Gemini 2.0 robots. So, and then they have like the model, which is available for other developers as well, is also extended to trusted testers like Boston Dynamics and Agile Robots and Agility Robots, and all bunch of tools. So it's an ecosystem that they're trying to develop, but it's pretty exciting, and dangerous. This just gonna make the machine how whole lot intelligent and smarter to in dealing the thing, and particularly unrecognized thing that they have not been trained on. That's a new capability that is being unlocked.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the day where each one of us has a robot in our house to do some of the mundane tasks. Because I forgot to take out the garbage the other day. It'd be great if I had a robot to do that. But that's on a personal level. You know, I love this advancement for what Google is doing around producing new models for robotics. I think this is going to be one of those areas that will just continue to grow. I know, here's a side note. Figure, who was working with OpenAI, kind of dismantled that relationship and is building their own model for robotics itself. So it would be interesting to see how the space is going to develop with folks like Figure and what they're doing, what Google DeepMind is doing with the Gemini Robotics, to see who wins out, which is going to be a better robot.
Yeah. In fact, OpenAI also, Sam Altman has always been interested in the robotics. In fact, it was part of their charter until they dropped it, but they are still interested. I think they will bring it back because, that was an entirely new realm, right, in which they need to go into as well to extend their capabilities. So we're going to see a lot more of robotics plus AI fusion. And in the final news of this episode, just a small new launch from Azure Microsoft, but I think it's pretty exciting. It is a PTUs with the spillover. So usually the PTUs, which are provision throughput units, they are like not a dedicated but reserved capacity that is available for Azure OpenAI models for customers to use, right? What it allows is it's kind of a 24 hours capacity. So you're paying for every hour, and you can make the hourly reservation or monthly reservation. But essentially, it gives you a very predictable capacity, right? Predictable latency. So it's not that some boxes are assigned to you, but some capacities are kind of given to you, and then you are more assured about it. Because otherwise, if you use the typical paygo apis, they work well off peak hours, but in the peak hours your latency could be pretty down, right? It may not be desired for the production workload. So ptus are recommended for any production workload or wherever the latency is sensitive topic. um, what this does is, however, what happens is, when let's say somebody has a workload which exceeds even the PTU's available capacity, what will happen? It will start throwing the 429 errors, right? That that you have to again send the request, things like that. And typically, the way to work around with on that was to use the API management, in which the API management will actually see if the requests are not being fulfilled anymore by a certain PTU capacity. It can redirect to another region, or it can redirect to another resource, or it can even send it to Paygo. Right? That's how the customers have implemented this. But with this is now like a embedded feature. So if the P2 is not able to handle the workload beyond the capacity what it already has, it will redirect that to the paygo endpoint and charge it, and that charge will be, of course, at the paygo rate. So it essentially brings um, that architecture pattern that the customers had to deploy themselves and create it. Now it brings that capability itself. Now, however, it's not default, so you have to actually opt in, you have to allow for it to be enabled. It is also available only for the global and the data zone PTU, so it's not for the regional. But I think it's a great new feature which customers can really use it and be assured that their requests will not run into 429, etc. as well.
Yeah, at the bottom of the day, it's all about how do we make it easier? How does Microsoft make it easier for organizations that are trying to run applications? And to me, this just makes sense because you don't want to stop an application just because quote unquote something has run out of headroom. So it's a logical next step, in my opinion, from what Microsoft is making available to its customers.
Absolutely, and it's in public preview for any customer to actually start using it. And I think that is it for now, Jamie.
Yeah, no, sounds good. And I'll save your voice there for a second. But I wanted to thank everybody again for listening, for watching this week's episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe and tell all your friends to listen into the AI files.
Absolutely. And keep talking. Talk
Right.
soon. Bye,
Thanks.
Jimmy.
Bye-bye.